Hello, my name is Brian Bowen. Welcome to my channel. Of course, I am a Christian apologist and a scholar of New Testament. And of course, I'm a jack of all trades of Christian apologetics. I study lots of different things. An area of interest that I study a lot on is history. In recent times, I was debating a guy by the name of Anuj Agarwal from India on Dr. Jonathan McClatchy's YouTube channel, where he does a debate review of his debate with Matt Dillahunty. He does this review with Timothy McGrew, and I responded to somebody on there, and then Anna Jagrawal responded to me, and we went back and forth like this over 2 weeks long, and where we kept going back and forth and back and forth, and well, uh, I end up doing a debate review also of this debate as well. I will link that in this. We'll link part one of that video in this in the this video description below the video. Um, and in that we got on this interesting conversation back and forth, back and forth. I mean, we went over the same arguments hundreds of times, um, responding to each other. Like I said, we were doing this for over 2 weeks. 220 posts. There was quite a bit of going back and forth. And we got on the subject of the Gospels being Greco-Roman biographies. Um, it's virtually unanimously accepted, just about among scholars, Christian and non-Christian alike, that the Gospels are Greco-Roman biographies, and the reason is because they have closely, much more similarities with the genre of Greco-Roman biographies than they have of any other genre, including historical novels. They're not historical novel at all. The Greco-Roman biographies. Um, Apollonius of Tyana is sometimes, and of course, being Greco-Roman biographies, their intent and goal was to record history. He argued differently, and he tried to bring up Apollonius of Tyana, which I told him was actually a historical novel, and I gave him lots of evidence for this, and he never did give me evidence against it or any other evidence in favor of it being a Greco-Roman biography. Um, Other than just kept making the assertion. And he made the assertion all the time. In fact, when we were in a correspondence, when he was doing the last rebuttals, he had the last rebuttals. I got the last conclusion in the debate. So I asked for clarification of something he said in the because I knew I was going to do a review of this debate, and I wanted clarification of something he said to make sure I understood his argument correctly. And he came back and he gave me the clarification, not a we weren't responding to each other. Um, it was just correspondence, and he referenced Apollonius of Tyana as biography Apollonius of Tyana. He did that on purpose because he knew that I did not agree with him on it at all, and that the evidence is very strong in favor of it being a Greco-Roman biography as I already presented. Um, but I started thinking about it on these issues, and I really wanted to address that because there are some disputes among scholars about whether it's Greco-Roman biography or not. There are some scholars like Bart Ehrman that will contend that Life of Apollonius of Tyana by Philostratus is a ancient biography, while others like Craig Keener, Mike Laconer, myself, and many others would contend that it's not an ancient biography. But in fact, most scholars actually would contend that it's not ancient biography, that it is more of a historical novel than ancient biography, although it does draw on some biographic conventions. Um, as Craig Keener had put it, and as I'm going to quote him in a little bit, um, increase its effectiveness, kind of like the way, and this is what Keener had said, kind of like the way Dan Brown does Da Vinci Code, where he subverts historical markers, where he would sit there and use just a little bit of history to make it sound believable, but the reality of it is a completely distorted and fictitious version of it. And so, in a similar manner, this is what Philostratus is doing with the life of Apollonius. So, it is definitely a historical biography. But I thought it'd be interesting to do an actual presentation of it. I'm going to do a PowerPoint presentation. This is the intro to that PowerPoint presentation. And without further ado, let's dive into it. All right, welcome to my presentation. This is presented by Brian Keith Bowen, that is me. Um, and its title is The Life of Apollonius of Tyana, Greco-Roman Biographies, Historical Novels, and the Gospels. And I just want to basically, real quickly, try to explain these concepts because there might be some confusion where people think that Greco-Roman biography is just blatantly just mix fiction and history, and then they conflate historical novels and Greco-Roman biographies, or they think certain historical novels like Life of Apollonius Tyana by Philostratus counts as historical or ancient biographies, and then they contrast that with other ancient biographies and say, see there, this is how ancient biographies really were, and therefore the Gospels were just kind of blending fiction and history, and that sort of thing. But that's what historical novels did. But we're going to get more into that as we progress. All right. Um, I mentioned already in the opening segment that that I'm inspired to write this because did a debate with a guy from India named Anuj Agarwal, and we went back and forth on lots of different issues. But one of them was about biographies, and of course, I did a debate review. I will link that in the description below, as already mentioned. Um, but this this concept, excuse me, this concept is what he in the debate he kept conflating historical novels and ancient biographies, and then he accused me of trying to apply a modern standard of understanding biographies, and that wasn't what I was doing at all. What I was doing is I was acknowledging the genre of ancient biographies and how they were presented. Um, what he was doing was he was conflating historical novels and ancient biographies and making it look like they were one. In fact, in the debate, I actually asked him once, how would you tell if what you say is true, then how would you ever be able to tell the difference between a historical novel and an ancient biography? And he never once answered me on that. All right. Apollonius of Tyana. I'm going to read you a citation that I got from Craig Keener's excellent work on this, Christobiography, page 46. He writes, of the two other works considered here, I put in brackets, Cyropedia by Xenophon and Alexander Romance by P.S. Callisthenes. Flavius Philostratus, CA 170 to CA 250 CE, is the more competent writer. His Life of Apollonius, commissioned by the Empress, is the more biographic and clearly draws on some historiographic and biographic conventions. Nevertheless, it differs starkly from the genuine biographies of Greek sophists, and its geography becomes demonstratively fictitious once it leaves the Roman world. Although Philostratus's Apollonius includes some characteristics of biography, it defies many biographic conventions, including in length and structure. It borrows the trappings of biography to increase its effectiveness, something like the way Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code subvert historical markers. It was novels that borrowed elements from history and other genres rather than the reverse. Even so, however, Philostratus' original title is not specifically biographic in Greek. Specifically biographic in Greek, it is not Life of Apollonius of Tyana, but simply things about Apollonius of Tyana. Craig Keener, Crystal Biography 46. um, Notice this reference here. It was novels that borrowed elements from history and other genres rather than the reverse. In other words, biographies didn't borrow elements from historical novels, say, for example. Rather, historical novels is the one who tried to borrow elements from them. And so that's a key feature there. One of the things that me and Anuj disagreed greatly on was whether ancient biography's intent or goal was to try to record history. He thought they were trying so hard, particularly on the Gospels. He thought they were just trying to evangelize the message so much that it didn't they weren't really concerned with being reliable historically or if they got their information right. And that's just completely false. That shows I'm not trying to say anything bad about Onyx personally, but it would show a complete ignorance of how ancient people wrote biographies. Because that's just, I mean, if anyone who's even familiar with Plutarch understands that when he didn't trust his sources, or if his sources were are long far removed, I mean, the earliest source he had was far removed from the person he was writing about, he would say he doesn't trust him. He would tell you that he doesn't trust him. And so this idea that somehow they would just make stuff up just on the fly, or not really concerned with getting information right, even though Luke actually said he went out and investigated the matter to make sure that Theophilus knew of the certainty of the things in which he had been taught. This shows a a a concern with making sure their information was indeed accurate. In fact, the fact that they used sources indicate that they were really making that effort. Um, Now, we're going to cover a little bit more about Apollonius of Tyana. Right now, I just want you to understand that this is by and large a historical novel. Right? It does have some biographic conventions, as Craig Keener mentioned. For example, it uses sources, even though its sources are highly questionable, as we'll talk about later. Um, but clearly, it is a historical novel. All right, let's continue. All right, let's talk about what Craig Keener said there at the end. Remember, he said, um, even so, however, Philostratus' original title is not specifically biographic in Greek. It is not Life of Apollonius of Tyana, but rather things about Apollonius of Tyana. And he's absolutely correct because it uses a particular Greek word that is not used for ancient biographies. Um, Let me read what I wrote here. The Greek word for life used in reference to all ancient biographies is bios or bioi, if plural. We actually get the prefix of biology, uh, bio, or bio. That's how we normally say it in English, the prefix bio, from the Greek word bios, the Greek word used for life in Philostratus's work, Life of Apollonius of Tyana, is a different Greek word, zoe. That's the Greek word here. It's zoe, which also means life in Greek, except that it is not synonymous with the same kind of life which bios is referring to. Instead, Zoe is referring to a general life. We get our French word zoo from this word. In contrast to the earlier, bios is referring to specific characteristics or information about a person, while the word zoe is referring to general information about a life without all of the specifics. What this means is that Philostratus' own title does not put his work on par with other ancient biographies. There it goes. All right, let's talk about the evidence against Life of Apollonius being an ancient biography. Even if it was an ancient biography, it is over 100 years after Apollonius of Tyana had lived. It is beyond what scholars call living memory. Now, this is if Apollonius of Tyana was actually a ancient biography. Even if it was, it's not. The evidence is very clear that it is not, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. But if it was, it is still over 100 years after Apollonius of Tyana had lived, because Apollonius of Tyana had lived in first century, and Philostratus is writing between early to mid third century. So you're talking about over 100 years after he had lived. This is also beyond what scholars call living memory, which is in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses and people who knew the eyewitnesses. It is often containing fictional elements to it and sounds like 3rd century in which the work was written in. Although Philostratus used sources, they were over 100 years later. His primary source, Damus, was most likely either made up or a pseudepigraphical literary work written by someone claiming to be Damus. The nature of how Philostratus came across this work, i.e., the pagan emperors who had commissioned him to write this work, is questionable, not to mention the fact that we do not have this work today to examine, although that does not mean that it didn't exist. Also, see Christo biography by Craig Keener, page 47. All right, all right, all right. In as for the Gospels as Greco-Roman biographies, the Gospels were about specific information concerning the life of another, i.e., Jesus. The Gospels use sources. They often use literary conventions or compositional devices, which was common in Greco-Roman biographies, such as telescoping and literary spotlighting, etc. They were of the right length and structure that Greco-Roman biographies typically have, 10,000 to 30,000 words. Um, Although the Gospels don't use the word bio for life, it does use the word kata, which means according to in Greek. At least many of our earliest manuscripts contain this title, although we don't know how the original manuscripts had the title, since we don't have the originals. It seems unlikely for them to use the word bios when there were other accounts floating around about Jesus. Luke mentions these, Luke 1 1. And if Matthew and Luke are using Mark, then at least were aware of these accounts. And it is possible that John might have either been aware of the Synoptic Gospels or these other accounts floating around. See John 21:25. Then it is less likely they would each designate these accounts as the life of Jesus or for that matter, the early church, since there would be no way to distinguish between these different accounts. Mike Lacona had also added in his book Why There Are Differences in the Gospels that we can learn from ancient biographies, what we can learn from ancient biographies, the following points, pages 3 to 4. They were uh, they were written in continuous, non-poetic narrative. The stories, sayings, uh, anecdotes, as well as speeches, which are groups of sayings, are combined together to form a narrative. The main character's life. Now, this is paraphrased from his work. I try not to do it verbatim because I was doing a point by point uh, rendering of his points. The main character's life is not always covered in chronological sequence, which is typical of Greco-Roman biographies, which because they are often more topological than chronological. Attention is more focused on a main character rather than on an era, as in a history or historiography, such as Thucydides' History of Peloponnesian War. And that's true because with a history, they're focusing more on the event. Myelocona referenced in that book that some people think that Luke's gospel ought to count as a historiography because of the way he does his preference. But the preference is the only thing that's really modeled after a historiography. The rest of it is pretty much ancient biography because he focuses on Jesus, not a particular event. Like historiographies do focus on a particular event. By the way, Mike wasn't saying that he supports that. He thinks all four Gospels is Greco-Roman biographies. He was just saying that there are some people that think that way because of Luke's preference in Luke 1 through 4, which is obviously modeled after the way historians do historiographies. Um, but the rest of his gospel is completely biographic in nature. Um, Little attention, if any, is given for psychological analysis of the primary character. And this is when I quoted him. We learn something of the main character's ancestry and then move rapidly along to the inauguration of his public life, like on page 4. I'm referencing the same work that I already mentioned, so that I just put his name and the page number, in which this was typical of Greco-Roman biographies, granting very little attention to the main character's early life and very minimal attention or information about their births, since it is their adult life where a person has made accomplishments, and therefore the biographer chooses to focus on it more so. All right. In as for the Gospel of Greco-Roman biographies, continue Michael Kern's comparison. Ancient biographies were of similar lengths. I already mentioned this. I already discussed this earlier. 10,000 and 25,000 words, roughly between 10 and 30,000. 25% to 35% of the verbs are considered dominated by the main character, while another 15% to 30% had occurred in Jesus' sayings, speeches, or even citations of him. The subject of the primary character is casted light upon their words as well as deeds as examples for readers to follow. This was typical of Greco-Roman biographies because they were focused on the morals and be able to highlight them as an example for other people to follow. And this is something that we see in the Gospels quite frequently, especially with Jesus, who is our example. In contrast with the Gospels were written within a period called living memory, contain many things verifiable outside historical with historical and archaeological evidence. Sounds like the first century sources, they clearly are, use Jewish names indicative of Palestine. Once you leave Palestine, you get different Jewish names. Use trusted literary sources, see Luke 1 through 4, and contain information closer to the facts, such as the pre-Mark and Passion narrative in Mark's Gospel, often dated to within 7 years of Jesus' crucifixion. This is not my exposition. I hope you know that. I already ended my discussion of his points. This is particularly in reference to my contrast with the Gospels. The Gospels clearly show a stronger affinity to history than what we have in Life of Apollonius. All right. Did ancient biographies intentionally fabricate history? Here I'm going to cite Michael Kona again. And why are there differences in the gospel? What we can learn from ancient biography. This time I'm citing him from page 17. In order to accomplish his objective, Plutarch, talking about the greatest of all biographies, he's written the most biographies of any other biographer I'm even aware of. Uh, he's written more than what we got, but we have about 50 extant manuscript or extant biographies from Plutarch, which is a quite significant number. And so this is Mike contrasting Plutarch, the way Plutarch writes his biographies. Plutarch occasionally bends the facts to support the portrait he is painting, a portrait that is largely true, although not always entirely in the details. He does not bend to mislead his readers, but rather to emphasize an important, deeper truth about his main character that readers can now grasp more fully and emulate. Like every biographer of his day, he had no commitment to present the facts with photographic accuracy or legal precision, nor would his intended readers have expected that of him or of any biographer. Accordingly, Plutarch's commitment to the truth in his lives is genuine but qualified. Basically, Mike is saying that although Plutarch is not concerned with legal precision, he's not concerned with pinpoint accuracy, the kind of thing that we typically look for in today's world. this is not what he looks for in or Plutarch and his readers would look for in ancient biography. Rather, the idea is okay, lack of precision is an error, nor is it historically inaccurate. And of course, historians judge them by the standards of their day. And clearly, Plutarch is writing according to his standards, and the standards in that day was that he was trying to paint a portrait, a literary portrait of the figure he was trying to portray. And in doing so, he had to take certain liberties for a wide variety of reasons, to save space, time, to emphasize or highlight certain characteristics or something of that nature. But the idea is that he wasn't trying to just make up a story about a person. Rather, he was trying to tell one. And this is what I tried, and I actually said those exact words that he was trying to tell one. And I told Anuj this, and I referenced this in the debate review as well, I think. All right, here's my conclusion. Life of Apollonius of Tyana is not an ancient biography, but more of a historical novel. There is too much evidence against it, namely, way too much differences between it and other ancient biographies. The evidence appears to weigh in favor of it being a historical novel. Apollonius of Tyana appears to blend fictional elements with history, which it was typical of historical novels and not ancient biographies. Not to mention the fact that Philostratus' work appears centered in a 3rd century setting, which is indicative of the time in which the work dates, rather than a 1st century setting, which is when Apollonius had lived. The Gospels have much more in common with Greco-Roman biographies, which was ancient biographies written within the early periods of the Roman Empire. These common features include, but not limited to, uh, uh, not limited to, they are the right lengths. They contain literary compositional devices typical of Greco-Roman biographies. They focus very little on Jesus' childhood, if they referenced it at all, which is typical of Greco-Roman biographies. They were written topological rather than chronological, etc. Ancient biographies were concerned with trying to record history, although they were not intended to be precise in the details. No reader of any ancient biography would have expected them to be that way, but their overall goal was to paint a literary portrait of a person, which was largely, or which was true. That's my conclusion on this, because ultimately the evidence supports that the Gospels are Greco-Roman biographies, and they're much more common in Greco-Roman biographies. And the Life of Apollonius of Tyana, and as well as Aesop's Fables, and you can throw in a few others, um, are definitely historical novels. They have much more in common with historical novels. It is historical novels that tend to blend fiction with history, which is what Onich kept conflating in our debate. I will link our debate in the description below. Thank you again for watching this video, this presentation. I hope you found it beneficiary. Please let me know what you think in the comment, and do not forget about hitting that subscribe button and the like, and like this video. It helps with the YouTube algorithm, it gets it for the top, and more people can get a hold of this information. Um, I plan on doing apologetic videos every week if I can. I will link my debate review with Anuj Agarwal from India in the description below. Thank you again for listening, and I hope we can do this again.